They called Grace Whitmore a gold digger, while Edward's coffin was still surrounded by white lilies. The words did not come as a whisper of grief, but as a polished little blade slipped between two hymns, spoken by Victoria Whitmore with her chin lifted and her black gloves folded over a pearl clutch. Grace stood at the front of the old Boston chapel, still in the same simple black dress she had worn since dawn, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her face pale beneath the stained glass light. Around her, the Whitmore family filled the first 3 rows like a board of directors pretending to mourn. Men in tailored navy suits checked their phones beneath folded programs. Women dabbed dry eyes with linen handkerchiefs. Outside, rain tapped against the chapel windows, soft and steady, as if the city itself knew better than to speak too loudly. Edward Whitmore had built hotels, rail lines, private hospitals, and a financial empire that stretched from New York to California. But at the end, his family spoke more about ownership than memory. Grace heard them. She heard Bradley Whitmore mutter that his uncle had lost his judgment the moment a pretty nurse started fluffing his pillows. She heard Madison say Grace probably already had a moving truck waiting outside the mansion gates. She heard the low, satisfied laugh that followed, the kind rich people gave when they believed the room belonged to them. Grace did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Edward's silver-framed photograph beside the casket, the one taken years before the illness, when his hair was still thick and gray and his smile carried the quiet arrogance of a man who had never once been asked to leave a room. No one in that chapel knew the Edward who could not button his own shirt after the first winter stroke. No one knew how often he stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m., ashamed of needing help. No one knew how gently he said thank you when Grace brought him water, or how his voice softened when she read him the morning markets from the Wall Street Journal because his hands shook too badly to hold the paper. To them, she was a stranger in a widow's dress. To Edward, she had been the only person who stayed after the applause left. When the service ended, Victoria approached her slowly, heels clicking against marble, each step measured for the audience still pretending not to watch. She did not embrace Grace. She reached past her and adjusted one white rose near the casket, as if even the flowers needed protection from the wrong hands. Then she leaned close enough for Grace to smell her expensive perfume and said, "You can stop pretending now, Grace. He's dead." For one breath, the chapel went silent. Grace looked at the woman beside her, then at the coffin, then down at the small wooden box Edward's attorney had placed in her hands that morning. She did not open it. She did not defend herself. She simply held it closer, as though the dead man inside the room had spoken one last warning only she could hear. By the time the last guest left the chapel, the rain had softened into a silver mist over Beacon Hill, turning every black car outside into a blurred reflection of money and mourning. Grace rode alone to the Whitmore mansion in the back seat of a town car Edward had ordered for her years ago, though the driver no longer looked at her through the mirror with the same warmth. Even silence had changed its posture around her. The mansion waited behind iron gates 12 miles outside Boston, a stone estate with 20,000 square feet of polished floors, oil portraits, and rooms so large they made grief feel staged. Grace stepped out with the wooden box tucked beneath one arm. No one offered her an umbrella. Victoria walked ahead beneath Bradley's. Madison followed with her phone already in her hand, and the rest of the family moved toward the front doors like shareholders entering a private meeting. Inside, the air smelled of old roses, leather, and expensive heat. The housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, stood near the staircase with red eyes and folded hands, the only person who lowered her head when Grace entered. Grace gave her the smallest nod, and that tiny exchange made Victoria pause as if kindness itself had become an insult. The family did not go to the sitting room where Edward used to listen to jazz at night. They chose the West Library, the room with dark shelves, a marble fireplace, and a conference table long enough to turn inheritance into strategy. Crystal glasses appeared. Bourbon was poured. Someone laughed too soon, then covered it with a cough. Grace remained near the doorway, her black dress still damp at the hem, while portraits of Whitmore men stared down from the walls with painted certainty. Bradley loosened his tie and asked when the attorney would arrive. Madison said Daniel Reeves was always dramatic, always late, always pretending paper had a soul. Victoria placed her pearl clutch on the table and looked at Grace the way a landlord might look at a tenant who had stayed past the lease. "You should understand something before this begins," she said, her voice smooth enough to pass for concern. "Edward was generous when he was lonely. That does not make every lonely decision permanent." Grace did not answer. She heard the sentence beneath the sentence. "You were a mistake. You will be corrected." One of Edward's nephews pulled out a yellow legal pad and began listing properties as if the dead man were already divided into addresses. The Nantucket House, the Manhattan Penthouse, the Napa Vineyard, the private hospital network, the shipping contracts, Whitmore Global Holdings. Grace watched ink move across the page and remembered Edward's hand trembling over a coffee cup, embarrassed because a man who had once signed billion-dollar deals could no longer trust his own fingers. Madison came closer, her heels soundless on the rug. "Do you even know what any of this is worth?" she asked. Grace looked at her calmly. She knew the price of 3 months of oxygen equipment. She knew the cost of a night nurse when insurance stopped answering calls. She knew what it meant to sit beside a man while his own children sent flowers instead of showing up. But she only tightened her hand around the box and said nothing. That was when Victoria smiled, reached into her bag, and removed a cream-colored envelope. It landed on the table in front of Grace with a soft, final sound. "We prepared something fair," Victoria said. "Sign it before Daniel gets here, and this can remain dignified." Grace looked down at the envelope, then toward the rain-streaked windows. Somewhere in that house, Edward's favorite clock struck 6, each chime slow and hollow, like the mansion itself was counting down to something none of them could stop. The envelope stayed unopened for several seconds, though every eye in the West Library had already decided what Grace should do with it. Bradley leaned back in Edward's leather chair as if he had been born into it, one ankle resting over his knee, a faint smile shaping his mouth. Madison lifted her phone just enough for Grace to see the dark screen, not recording yet, only threatening the possibility of it. Victoria tapped one black-gloved finger on the cream paper. "It is not cruel," she said. "It is practical." Grace looked at the envelope, then at the fountain pen placed beside it, its gold clip shining under the chandelier. The offer inside was meant to sound merciful. $10 million, a quiet exit, a signed agreement promising she would never contest the will, never speak to the press, never claim a role in the Whitmore estate, never return to the mansion after midnight. For a woman who had once counted quarters at a laundromat in Somerville and worked double shifts to cover her mother's hospital bills, $10 million should have felt impossible. It should have made the room spin. But Grace only remembered Edward sitting in the breakfast room 2 winters earlier, his robe folded neatly over his knees, watching snow gather along the hedges. "They think money measures hunger," he had told her, voice rough from medication. "But it also reveals fear." At the time, she thought he was speaking about business. Now, standing under his family's chandelier, she understood he had been speaking about this exact moment. Madison stepped closer, her perfume sharp and sweet. "Let us not pretend you came into this marriage with options," she said. "We know about the apartment with the broken radiator. We know about the medical debt. We know you worked nights at a rehab clinic in Quincy. There is no shame in taking what you can and leaving before this gets embarrassing." Grace raised her eyes. There was no anger in them, only a stillness that made Madison look away first. On the table, the legal pad had become a map of greed. Nantucket, Manhattan, Napa, hospitals, holdings, votes, seats, names written like territory. Not once had anyone written Edward. Not once had anyone asked what he wanted after the body left the chapel and the flowers began to fade. Victoria opened the envelope herself and slid the papers toward Grace with 2 fingers. "This is more than fair. $10 million wired by morning. A car to Logan Airport. You can start over anywhere in the country. Arizona, Florida, wherever women like you go when the story ends." The room gave a soft little laugh, polite enough to deny later. Grace reached for the pen. The sound of Madison's breath catching was almost invisible. Bradley sat forward. Victoria's smile widened, not with kindness, but with relief. They thought dignity had a price. They thought silence meant surrender. Grace lifted the pen, turned it once between her fingers, and placed it carefully back exactly where it had been. Then she pushed the papers away, not far, only a few inches, but enough to make every glass on the table feel suddenly too loud. "Edward asked me never to sign anything under insult," she said. Her voice was calm, barely above the rain against the windows. Before anyone could answer, the front door chime sounded through the mansion. Mrs. Alvarez appeared at the library entrance, her eyes moving from Grace to Victoria. "Mr. Reeves is here," she said, "and he is not alone." The sound of Daniel Reeves arriving should have pulled Grace fully back into the West Library, but for one strange second, the room thinned around her. The bourbon, the chandelier, Victoria's cold smile, Bradley sitting in Edward's chair as if inheritance were a birthright. All of it faded behind the soft memory of a hospital monitor and fluorescent lights humming above a narrow bed. Grace had first met Edward Whitmore not in a ballroom, not beneath a crystal ceiling, not at one of those charity dinners where men gave away money with one hand and protected power with the other. She met him at Massachusetts General on a Tuesday morning, after a storm had shut down half the city and left dirty. Snow piled along the curb outside the emergency entrance. He was not wearing a suit then. He was not surrounded by assistants. He was an older man in a white hospital gown, furious at the weakness in his own body, staring at a plastic cup of water like it had become an enemy. His right hand shook too much to lift it. His voice had been rough, uneven, trapped somewhere between pride and fear. 2 nurses before her had tried to help him too quickly, speaking over him, finishing his sentences, smoothing his blankets as if kindness meant speed. Edward hated that most. He had spent his life making rooms wait for him, and now everyone was rushing past the one thing he could not buy back. Grace had entered quietly, checked his chart, and said, "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. I am Grace Bennett. I will not hurry you." He looked at her then, sharply, suspiciously, as though patience were a trick. For almost a full minute, he said nothing. Grace did not fill the silence. She adjusted the blinds by 3 inches because the winter sun was cutting across his eyes. She moved the water closer, not into his hand, only within reach. Then she placed a small notepad beside him and uncapped a pen. Edward stared at the pen, then at her. His fingers moved slowly, stubbornly, dragging one crooked word across the paper. "Water." Grace read it, nodded once, and held the cup while he drank through a straw, not looking away when his pride trembled harder than his hand. That was the first thing she gave him. Not admiration, not pity. Time. Over the following weeks, the Whitmore family visited in expensive bursts. Victoria came with flowers arranged by someone else and left before the vase water warmed. Madison brought magazines and took photos in the hallway where the lighting was flattering. Bradley arrived once with a tablet full of documents and spoke about signatures before asking how Edward had slept. Grace remembered Edward watching the door close after each visit, his face still, his eyes fixed on the place where family should have lingered. At night, when the city outside dropped below 30 degrees and the hospital windows reflected nothing but pale rooms and tired faces, Grace read him the financial pages because he asked for them, but she also read the weather, baseball scores, and small local stories from towns he owned buildings in but had never visited. Sometimes he corrected her pronunciation of a board member's name. Sometimes he fell asleep before she reached the second column. Once, near 3 in the morning, he opened his eyes and asked, "When I am no longer useful, will anyone still sit here?" Grace had looked up from folding a blanket at the foot of his bed. She did not promise forever. She did not dress loneliness in pretty words. She only said, "I am already here." Back in the West Library, the front door closed in the distance, and Grace felt the wooden box beneath her arm like a heartbeat Edward had left behind. The family heard footsteps approaching. Grace heard the past returning with documents in its hands. Daniel Reeves entered the West Library with the careful posture of a man carrying more than paper. He was in his late 60s, tall and narrow, with silver hair combed back from a tired face and a leather briefcase held close to his side. Beside him stood a woman Grace had only seen once before in an old company photograph tucked inside Edward's desk. Helen Morris, former chief financial officer of Whitmore Global, wore a charcoal coat still wet at the shoulders and carried no handbag, no jewelry, no expression that asked permission. The moment Bradley saw her, the color moved out of his face in a quiet, private way. Victoria noticed it too. Her hand tightened around the stem of her glass. "Daniel," she said, standing just enough to remind the room of her name. "This is a family matter." Daniel placed his briefcase on the table. Mr. Whitmore made it a legal matter. No one spoke after that. Even the rain seemed to lean closer to the windows. Grace stood near the doorway with the wooden box pressed against her ribs, feeling the weight of it grow heavier with every second. It was not large, maybe 8 inches wide, made of dark walnut worn smooth at the corners. Edward had kept it on the shelf beside his bed during his last month at home, beneath the photograph of the first brick warehouse he bought before anyone in Boston knew the Whitmore name. He had never opened it in front of her. He had only touched the lid once and said, "When the room becomes loud, let this answer quietly." At the time, Grace thought it was another one of his riddles, the kind illness had made softer but not less sharp. Now Daniel began removing sealed envelopes, each marked with Edward's initials in blue ink, and Grace felt a strange pull in her hand, as if the box were not waiting for permission from the living. She stepped back into the shadow near the bookshelves and found the tiny brass latch beneath her thumb. It opened with a click so small no one but Mrs. Alvarez seemed to hear it. Inside, there were no diamonds, no necklace, no emergency cash, nothing that would have satisfied the story they had written for her. There was a safe deposit key taped to a white card, a folded photograph of Edward standing outside a brick factory in a winter coat from the 1980s, and a note in his slanted handwriting. Grace unfolded it slowly. "When they call you what they are, let the documents answer." Her throat tightened, not from surprise, but from the ache of being understood by someone no longer in the room. Beneath the note was a thin flash drive labeled with 3 words, "Board audit copies." Grace closed her fingers around it just as Bradley's voice cut across the table. "Why is Helen here?" he demanded. Helen looked at him, calm as stone. "Because your uncle asked me to bring back what you buried." Madison's phone slipped lower in her hand. Victoria turned toward Daniel, her smile no longer smooth. "Read the will," she said. Daniel looked at Grace first, not the family, not the portraits, not the men already measuring Edward's empire. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "you may want to sit down." Grace closed the box, but she did not sit. She stayed standing, the key hidden in her palm, while the first seal broke open like thunder wearing a whisper. Daniel did not begin with money. That was the first thing that unsettled them. He opened the first envelope, adjusted his glasses, and read Edward's instructions for the funeral expenses, the chapel donation, the nurse's scholarship at Massachusetts General, and a private fund for long-term care patients whose families had stopped visiting. No one at the table moved, but the silence changed shape. Bradley looked irritated, as if compassion were a delay tactic. Madison crossed her arms and stared at the rain sliding down the windows. Victoria remained standing, her face composed, though the skin around her mouth had tightened. Grace stayed near the shelves with the wooden box closed against her side and the small key hidden in her palm. Edward's words moved through the library in Daniel's steady voice. Ordinary words on legal paper, but each one carried the weight of a man who had spent his final months watching who entered his room and who only sent flowers. Then Daniel began reading the individual bequests. To Victoria, Edward left the Cape Cod summer house, fully maintained for 5 years, with the condition that it could not be sold during that time. Victoria blinked once, slowly. It was a beautiful property, worth millions, but it was not control. To Madison, he left the Fifth Avenue apartment and a trust that released quarterly payments, protected from liquidation, protected from borrowing, protected from the kind of emergencies people created when they confused lifestyle with legacy. Madison's lips parted as if the words had arrived in the wrong order. To Bradley, Edward left a vintage car collection, 1 ranch property in Wyoming, and a board seat subject to annual ethics review. The pen in Bradley's hand stopped moving. "Ethics review," he repeated. Daniel kept his eyes on the page. "That is what Mr. Whitmore wrote." A murmur moved around the table. Cousins received art, jewelry, restricted funds, charitable obligations dressed as gifts. Every inheritance sounded generous enough to praise in public and controlled enough to insult in private. Edward had given them wealth, but he had locked every door that led to power. Victoria placed both hands on the table. "Where is the company?" she asked. Daniel folded the first page and placed it aside. "We are not there yet." Bradley gave a short laugh that failed before it became convincing. "This is ridiculous. Uncle Edward had diminished capacity. Everyone knows that." Helen Morris finally stepped forward, her wet coat dark against the firelight. "No, Bradley. Everyone was told that." The room went still. Grace watched Victoria turn toward Helen with the slow caution of someone recognizing an old threat. "You resigned," Victoria said. Helen looked at her without blinking. "I was removed after I questioned offshore transfers. I was not allowed to audit." Madison lowered her phone completely now. One of the cousins shifted away from the table. Daniel reached into his briefcase again and removed a second sealed packet, thicker than the first, its edges marked with colored tabs. "Mr. Whitmore anticipated objections regarding his mental capacity," he said. "So he recorded physician statements, board correspondence, and notarized confirmations over a period of 11 months. Bradley stood too quickly, his chair scraping against the rug. "You cannot bring corporate accusations into a will reading." Daniel looked up at him. "Your uncle already did." Grace felt the key press into her skin, small and cold. Across the room, Mrs. Alvarez stood silently by the door, tears held behind her eyes like a secret she had carried alone for too long. Victoria turned back to Grace, and for the first time that evening, her expression was not contempt. It was calculation. "What did he give you?" she asked. Grace did not answer because she did not know. Daniel broke the second seal, and the sound was softer than a match being struck, but everyone in the West Library looked as if something had caught fire. Daniel unfolded the second packet with the care of a priest opening a confession. No one sat comfortably anymore. Bradley remained standing, one hand gripping the back of Edward's chair, the other curled around nothing. Victoria had gone very still, her pearl clutch forgotten on the table. Madison watched Grace now, not with mockery, but with the first thin shadow of doubt. Daniel cleared his throat, and when he began reading again, his voice did not rise. That made it worse. "I, Edward James Whitmore, being of sound mind and clear intention, hereby transfer all controlling interest held in my personal trust, including 61% of voting shares in Whitmore Global Holdings, to my wife, Grace Elizabeth Whitmore." The room did not gasp. It emptied. Sound seemed to leave through the rain-streaked windows and vanish into the dark lawn beyond the glass. Grace stood with the wooden box against her side, the safe deposit key hidden in her palm, and felt the words reach her slowly, as if they had traveled from a place where Edward was still alive, still watching her across the breakfast table, still waiting to see whether she would finally understand. Bradley laughed once, too loudly, too sharply, and pointed toward Daniel as if volume could reverse ink. "That is not possible." She was his caregiver. She was not involved in the company. Helen Morris looked at him across the table. "Neither were you, not in any way that helped it." His face tightened. Madison whispered something under her breath, but even she did not lift her phone now. Daniel continued. "Mrs. Grace Whitmore is appointed chair of the Whitmore Family Trust and interim chair of the board, effective immediately upon my passing. She shall hold the authority to suspend executive privileges, initiate independent audit procedures, review all family compensation agreements, and appoint outside counsel without requiring approval from any current beneficiary." Victoria put one hand to the edge of the table. Not for drama, for balance. The Cape Cod house, the apartment, the trust payments, the car collection, all the polished gifts suddenly looked like beautiful rooms with locked doors. Grace had not been handed a souvenir. She had been handed the keys to the building. Bradley stepped away from Edward's chair as if it had turned cold beneath him. "She does not even know what EBITDA means," he said, forcing a smile at the others. "This is absurd." Grace looked at him then, quietly. She remembered Edward at the kitchen table, asking her to read board summaries aloud because his eyes tired by noon. She remembered stopping him whenever he tried to pretend he understood a report his medication had blurred. She remembered the first time he said, "Do not let Bradley near the debt covenants." She had asked what that meant. Edward had smiled, faintly, and said, "It means he likes doors that open only from the inside." Daniel placed another document on the table. Mr. Whitmore also left a memorandum regarding his reasons. Victoria's voice came thin and low. Edward would never give this family to a stranger. Grace finally moved. She walked to the table, set the wooden box down gently beside the unsigned settlement papers, and opened her palm. The small brass key caught the chandelier light. Helen Morris saw it and exhaled, almost like relief. Daniel looked at the key, then back to Grace. "He told me you might find that before we reached this section." Grace lifted her eyes to Victoria, not cruelly, not triumphantly. only with a calm that made the older woman look suddenly tired. "He told me the documents would answer," Grace said. Daniel reached into his briefcase one last time and removed a black flash drive sealed in a clear evidence sleeve. "Then it is time," he said, "for Edward to answer for himself." Daniel connected the flash drive to the library screen with hands so steady they made everyone else look exposed. The black monitor above the fireplace came alive, first with a pale reflection of the room, then with Edward Whitmore sitting in his upstairs study, wrapped in a navy cardigan, thinner than the portrait on the wall behind Grace, but sharper in the eyes than any sick man had a right to be. For a moment, no one breathed loudly enough to disturb him. The recording was dated 3 weeks before his death. Edward looked directly into the camera, not like a man saying goodbye, but like a man calling a final meeting to order. "If you are watching this," he said, his voice rough but clear, "then I am gone, and the people who ignored me while I was alive are probably fighting over what I built." Victoria closed her eyes. Bradley stared at the screen as though refusing to recognize the man inside it. Madison sat down without meaning to, her phone silent in her lap. Edward continued, "Let me be clear. I did not leave Grace control because she flattered me. I did not leave her control because I was lonely. I left it to her because when I had nothing left to offer but inconvenience, she was the only person in this family who did not calculate the cost of staying." Grace stood very still beside the table. Her face did not break. Only her fingers moved, slowly closing around the edge of the wooden box. On the screen, Edward leaned back and drew a careful breath. "For 11 months, I reviewed what was done in my name while my health was being used as an excuse to keep me quiet. Unauthorized transfers, inflated consulting fees, family compensation agreements never approved by the full board, debt hidden under shell subsidiaries. And when Helen Morris questioned the numbers, she was pushed out before she could complete the audit." Helen lowered her eyes, not in shame, but in the exhausted relief of hearing the truth spoken by someone powerful enough to make the room obey it. Bradley's voice came out strained. "This is edited." Daniel did not look at him. "It is notarized." Edward's recording went on. "Victoria, you tried to have my doctors declare me incapable after I refused to sign the restructuring papers. Madison, you sold board discussions to people who smiled at you over lunch and bet against our stock by dinner. Bradley, you treated Whitmore Global like a private wallet and called it leadership because no one had told you no in 20 years. No one shouted. That was what made it colder. The accusations landed like sealed envelopes, one after another, impossible to argue with because each one had already been expected by the dead man on the screen. Then Edward's voice softened, and for the first time, he looked less like a chairman and more like the man Grace had known at 3 in the morning, when pride was too tired to stand guard. "Grace did not know everything. I did not want her burdened with all of it while I was still here. But she knew enough to protect the original documents when she found them missing from my desk. She knew enough to call Helen after I asked her to. She knew enough to refuse money 3 times when leaving would have been easier. And most important, she knew when to remain silent, so the guilty would keep talking." Grace finally looked at Victoria, not with victory, with understanding. Victoria's face had gone pale beneath the chandelier, and the $10 million offer still sat between them like evidence of its own confession. Edward took one final breath on the screen. "They will call her a gold digger because they only understand hunger. But Grace never asked me for the empire. That is why I trusted her with it." The video ended. The screen went black. In the reflection, Grace saw them all behind her, smaller now, seated beneath portraits that no longer seemed to belong to them. For a long moment after the screen went black, no one in the West Library seemed willing to be the first living person to speak. The rain had stopped, but the windows still held silver trails of water, and beyond them the lawn lay dark and quiet under the mansion lights. Grace stood beside the table with Edward's wooden box closed again beneath her hand. The $10 million settlement sat a few inches away, and signed, almost delicate now, like a trap that had forgotten its teeth. Victoria looked at it, then at Grace, and something in her posture shifted from command to negotiation. "Grace," she said, and the name sounded unfamiliar in her mouth, stripped of insult for the first time that evening. "This family has been through enough. We can handle this privately." Grace looked at Daniel. "Can we begin the independent audit tomorrow morning?" Daniel nodded. 9 o'clock. Outside counsel is already on retainer, as Mr. Whitmore instructed. Bradley stepped forward, his face tight with disbelief. You cannot just walk into a company you do not understand and take the chair. Grace turned to him slowly. There was no anger in her eyes, only the steady calm of someone who had spent months beside a man learning the shape of every silence he left behind. Edward understood it, she said, and he taught me who was damaging it. Helen Morris placed a folder on the table, thick with marked pages and neat tabs. The first review will cover executive compensation, related party contracts, debt restructuring, and the offshore transfers. At those words, Madison lowered her gaze to the carpet. Victoria's hand moved to her pearls, then stopped, as if even that gesture had become too rehearsed to trust. Grace picked up the unsigned papers Victoria had pushed toward her earlier. She did not tear them. She did not throw them. She simply placed them back inside the cream envelope and slid it across the table until it rested in front of Victoria. You offered me money to disappear, Grace said. Edward gave me responsibility to stay. The room absorbed the sentence without answering. Mrs. Alvarez, still waiting near the door, wiped one tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. Grace saw it, and for the first time all evening, her expression softened. She lifted the wooden box, tucked the keys safely inside, and turned toward the door. Mrs. Alvarez, she said, please lock the east wing tonight. No files, drives, or company records leave this house without Daniel's approval. The housekeeper straightened as if a window had opened in a room long sealed. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. Victoria flinched at the title. Grace heard it, but did not look back. In the foyer, the chandelier cast warm light over the marble floor, and Edward's favorite clock struck 7, its tone no longer hollow, but clear. At the front doors, Grace paused only long enough to look at the portrait of Edward above the staircase. Not the public photograph from the chapel, not the founder with his perfect suit and polished smile, but a smaller painting from his early years, standing outside the first brick factory with snow on his shoulders and impossible ambition in his eyes. Grace touched the lid of the box once, then stepped outside. The storm had passed. The air smelled of wet stone and pine, and beyond the iron gates, the road curved into darkness. Behind her, the Whitmore mansion remained lit, full of people who had mistaken inheritance for entitlement and silence for weakness. Grace opened the black umbrella even though the rain was gone. She did not need it anymore. She simply liked the way it felt in her hand, steady, useful, chosen. She walked past the line of parked luxury cars without slowing down. By morning, the audit would begin. By noon, the board would know her name. And by the end of the week, every locked room Edward left behind would finally open.